I didn't even know that this was a thing that I could do.
So for one section of my in-ground bed, I decided to do a Three Sisters garden. So that would be corn, beans, and squash. And I chose varieties that I love to eat. So I've got some winter squash, I've got some zucchini, I've got some yellow squash. I chose some black beans because that's another thing that I really enjoy eating. And I got some sweet corn. I've never successfully grown sweet corn before, but I just thought, wouldn't it be fun if I had my own homegrown corn? I read about this method when I read the book Braiding Sweetgrass. I'm pretty sure I had seen something about Three Sisters gardening before that as well. It's a pretty common term in the gardening world, but essentially taken from Native American practice to grow these three crops together. The three crops, corn, bean, and squash, are the three sisters, and they work together by each supporting each other in a different way. So the corn provides the scaffolding or the structure that the beans can climb on to grow up and to get to the sun, and the beans provide the corn nitrogen fixation in the soil, which means that the corn is going to grow stronger and be able to produce more fruit or ears of corn, as well as the squash. Those big wide leaves can help shade the ground, which is going to prevent some evaporation, keep more moisture in the soil, and also help suppress weeds from growing up and competing with those plants. So I obviously am not the expert in this. I've read about it a little bit, and I'll link an article in the description box below to talk a little bit more about Three Sisters gardening. But this is just a method that I had heard about, had done a little bit of research on, and really wanted to try it this year. So I have planted in a cluster my corn plants because I understand from my research that corn likes to grow together in a bunch because it's wind pollinated. The plants seem to be close together so that they blow and touch as the wind blows so that they can get pollinated and grow the delicious ears of corn that we want to eat. So I have those in a cluster in the center, and then I've got squash plants kind of spread out because squash plants get quite big, and then I just have beans sort of everywhere in a circle surrounding the corn. So that's what I'm doing right now. I planted some from starts and I put in some seeds, and I haven't had great success growing all of these things from seed, even though the research online states that you really should all just plant them as seeds and let them grow up together. I did sort of a mix of that variety. I put some seeds in the ground. I started some in my seedling trays and transplanted those in, and we'll just see how it works throughout the season, and kind of learn from our mistakes, learn from things that we are able to do this year and produce this year, and hopefully get better at this type of gardening.
I am so excited about this. I started a Three Sisters garden this year, and I had never grown corn before. I had squash in previous gardens, and I had never really grown beans before either, but maybe green beans, but not like beans that you dry and save. I am just so blown away by the success of this garden. It's going super well, and I just have a feeling, an inkling, that we may get corn this year because we have tassels. And as like a home gardener who's only ever had a small, tiny garden plot or a raised bed or two or some containers in an apartment, like that is just so exciting. I have never seen that in my own garden, only in like huge commercial farms. So I didn't even know that this was a thing that I could do. Got, ooh, look at that pretty baby. This one is just escaping the garden. If I had known a little bit more about squash, I probably would have put my winter squash in the back and my zucchini squash in the front, since you harvest zucchini squash more often and winter squash need a whole growing season. Also, because these are more viney, they probably would have liked growing up the fence. So if we do this garden again next year, I will certainly put the winter squash in the back and the zucchini squash in the front.
While overall I thought the Three Sisters garden was very successful this year, one of the parts of the garden that really struggled was my squash. In the past, I've had really good success with growing zucchini squash in raised beds or containers on their own, but in this garden, perhaps because they were competing for space with other plants or they just weren't getting the pollination that they needed, they did not produce very many zucchini. I had a few, but not a lot, and some of the ones that grew seemed to be sort of weird or misshapen, kind of small and stunted, which makes me believe that they are not properly pollinated. You'll see here that I have a lot of male flowers on my zucchini, but not a ton of the female flowers. So I'm thinking pollination is perhaps the issue.
Got one little zucchini squash. Beans are doing great.
I really didn't follow an exact planting plan for this garden. I didn't have a specific number of seeds that I was going to put in the ground or place that I was going to put the plants. I just sort of planted as the spirit moved me. So I feel like perhaps the type of beans that I chose, or maybe I just had too many bean plants that crowded out the zucchini, because especially as it got to be later in July and into August, the beans really filled the space. It also looks like perhaps they're more of a bush bean variety that didn't climb as much as I thought that they would. I'm not exactly sure what the issue was with this particular squash. I know that a lot of people in the Midwest have issues with fungus or powdery mildew or even squash vine borer beetles attacking their squash plants, and typically I wouldn't do anything other than just to pull out the bad plants and just say, I guess that's all the squash that we're going to get this season. One thing that I did learn this year that was a tip that I wanted to share with you is that the squash vine borer beetle, its larva is only out 2 or 3 weeks in June. And that if you planted your zucchini plants from seed in June after that window, you would still have enough time to get a harvest before the frost, and you would miss the, feeding window of those larvae, and so perhaps you would at least not have issues with that pest. I don't have a solution yet for powdery mildew. If anyone does, let me know in the comments below, or if you have any other squash growing tips, I would appreciate it. By the time I'm recording this video, it is nearly end of season for my Three Sisters garden. I don't anticipate that I'm going to get very many more ears of corn or squash, and I did harvest all the beans out of my garden. But I wanted to talk quickly about maintenance, one of the things that I did to maintain the garden. This was a new garden bed that I put in this year, so I mixed in a lot of compost with the native soil that was there when I created the bed, and I added slow release organic fertilizer about every 2 weeks whenever I could remember to do it to the soil, because I know that corn and beans are heavy feeders, and that although beans are a nitrogen fixer, the nitrogen that they are producing in their roots is not going to be immediately available to things like corn in the first year of growing the garden. So I wanted to make sure that it had sufficient nutrition in the soil as well as water. Corn is another plant that needs really consistent watering, so watering every day was a really important part of keeping this garden healthy and helping it to grow. Obviously, I'm a busy mom. This was not something I always did on my own. I had lots of help from family to also keep this watered and make sure that it got what it needed every day. Here I am in the bed trying to just clear up some of the weeds. Looking back on it, I wish that I would have put some mulch or something down on the ground. I really wanted to just do the experiment of the corn, the beans, and the squash and see what would happen. But because this was a new bed and the soil mix that it was in was not perfect, we did get a lot of weeds that were just, coming up from the seed bed of what was already in there. So as I'm building the soil for this bed in the future, I think I might try to, mulch the bottom of the bed. Here's an example of one of the squash plants, one of the weird squash that didn't get fully pollinated. I think that that's the reason that they're not growing big. I mean, you can see there's a healthy one behind it on the other plant. Some of the plants just weren't doing particularly well. I did cut back all the leaves that had any sort of fungus or pest issue. But overall, this was not the best squash year. Some healthy ones in there, some really nice looking ones. And we did get quite a few good ears of corn out of this garden as well. So that's really exciting. I'm checking the corn to see if it's in the milk stage. I've heard online that if you squeeze one of the kernels and it is milky, then that means it's done. And if it is not, then it needs more time. So definitely a learning curve on this garden to know when things are ready to harvest, what things look like when they're healthy, and a lot of things that I can take forward into next year's garden to be even more successful. Sadly, I did pull this ear of corn off of the corn stalk before it was ready. You can see that the kernels have not fully formed yet, and that another telltale sign that you're looking for is that the end of the silks should be completely brown and dried before you pull your ear of corn off. This one was super big and pretty. I think it was one of the heirloom varieties, not necessarily sweet corn. I planted a bunch of different seeds, not necessarily all the same ones. It looked beautiful on the corn. I kind of wish I hadn't harvested it, because even if I didn't eat it, it would have looked really pretty as a Halloween slash fall decor decoration. But it's just interesting to sort of see how the kernels grow and what they look like in their different stages. I would definitely try planting a Three Sisters garden again. It was a lot of fun to grow this garden. Some things that I feel like I've definitely learned is that you should plant your crops in succession. You're supposed to plant your corn from seed 2 weeks ahead of everything else. So corn first, so it can get a little bit taller. And then you plant your beans after your corn so that they can grow up and start to climb the corn as after the corn has gotten big enough. And after you add your bean seeds, then you're going to add your squash seeds last. I didn't realize that the seeds weren't to be planted all at the same time. Also, I did start some of mine from starts just because I was so eager to get started planting and I really wanted to see the crop succeed. So I think I might try that next year to see if that might be more successful, as well as I will choose a different variety of beans. The black beans were very prolific, and I got a ton of black beans that I'm going to be able to save both for seed for next year and for eating. However, I don't think the black bean variety that I was growing was really a vining type of a bean that worked well for this type of a garden. I think it was competing with the squash on the ground level of the garden, and it would have been better if I had something like green beans or some other type of runner bean that would have grown up the stalks of the corn and left more of the ground space available for the squash to occupy. I also would consider planting something like sunflowers towards the back fence of this garden. I think having additional flowers might help attract more pollinators and maybe help solve some of the pollination issues that I had with the squash. Thanks so much for sharing time with me today in the garden as I was tending my Three Sisters garden bed. This style of planting was new to me this year, and there was definitely a bit of a learning curve. It was a lot of fun to try a new growing style, and I'm proud of what I've been able to grow in this small plot. I learned a lot from both my successes and my mistakes, and I'm excited for the opportunity to try this again in next year's garden. Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever planted a Three Sisters garden? And which varieties of the corn, bean, and squash plants did you grow? By the way, if you're new here, my name is Raina. I love nature and the outdoors, gardening, and cooking from scratch. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you can follow along my journey. If you enjoyed this video and want to keep hanging out with me, I'll link my August garden tour and my gardening playlist at the end screen for you to watch until my next upload. See you in the next one, friend. Bye!